Imagine waking up and finding every US soldier, pilot, and sailor in Europe gone. Airbases silent. The stars and stripes lowered from gates that have flown it for generations. Overnight, the world's most powerful alliance loses its largest member. This is September's community-requested video. You asked, and we deliver. I'm Tuomas, a former officer in the Finnish Defense Forces, and today we'll discuss what would really happen if Donald Trump pulled all US troops out of Europe. What gaps would it leave behind? How much could Europe handle alone? And what would it cost the United States to walk away? Right now, roughly 84,000 US troops are stationed across Europe, from the Arctic Circle to the Black Sea. You'll find them flying F-15s out of Lakenheath in the UK, manning missile defenses in Poland, running logistics hubs in Ramstein, Germany, and Aviano, Italy. They aren't guests. For decades, they've been the glue that holds NATO's day-to-day operations together. But Europe in 2025 is not the Europe of the 1990s. Since the invasion of Ukraine, defense spending has surged, industries have mobilized, and the continent has begun to relearn the habits of collective defense. A much-threatened US withdrawal would be a shock, but not the end. It would be the start of Europe standing entirely on its own feet, and while there would be gaps, NATO's European partners have more than enough firepower to easily be the second most powerful military in the world. The first most immediate gap would appear where most people never see it, in the skies and in space. The US currently provides around 70% of NATO's strategic intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capacity. Rivet Joint aircraft, E-3 Sentries, Global Hawks, and a vast constellation of American military satellites feed almost every NATO operation. Europe does have its own systems. France's Helios satellites, Germany's SAR Lupe and Sarah, Spain, Italy, and Finland's national programs, and the EU's Copernicus network, plus the Alliance ground surveillance drones in Italy. But together, they're still only a third of US capability. Without American ISR, Europe wouldn't be blind, but it would be half-sighted. The ability to track Russian movements, monitor missile launches, or detect undersea activity would drop sharply. To close that gap, Europe would need to pool its national assets, invest heavily in autonomous satellites, and expand its drone fleets, something already underway through Franco-German and EU defense programs, in particular in cooperation with Ukrainian developers. The capacity exists. The challenge is scaling it fast enough. Again, though, the reality is that it wouldn't be the US that Europe would be competing with. Compared to, an example, China or Russia, Europe is on par with China's abilities and far beyond Russia's. If intelligence is NATO's nervous system, logistics is its bloodstream, and the United States pumps most of it. That's partly by design. Europe isn't planning another Afghanistan-style expedition. In a war close to home, say against Russia, European forces would lean on railways and road convoys, not intercontinental air bridges. I covered that in detail in my video on European logistics, how the continent's infrastructure shapes its ability to move troops east. The US, by contrast, still plans to move armies across oceans. That's why the US Air Force's 220 C-17s, more than 50 C-5s, and several hundred C-130s, backed by nearly 500 aerial tankers and a fleet of pre-positioned sealift ships, form the backbone of NATO's mobility. By contrast, all of Europe combined fields barely a dozen super-heavy airlifts and a little over 100 heavy airlifters, supported by a few hundred smaller transports like the Hercules and the new Embraer Millennium, most tied up in national fleets. Enough for regional operations, not a sustained continental war. The most visible loss would be the forward presence. US brigades in Poland, Romania and Germany, air wings in Italy and the UK, and rotational forces in the Baltics are more than deployments. They're a signal that an attack on one is an attack on all. Until Donald Trump's election, they were also a way for US presidents to guarantee that Russia would never test that promise. Pull those forces out, and Europe's deterrence posture shifts from immediate to delayed. NATO's credibility has always rested on American power being physically present on European soil. And behind that presence lies the nuclear umbrella. The United States currently stations tactical nuclear weapons in 5 European countries under NATO sharing arrangements. If they were withdrawn, the only deterrents left would be those of France and the United Kingdom. But here's the interesting part. Europe already has the basis of its own deterrence. France's force de dissuasion, its nuclear triad of submarines, bombers, and soon land-based missiles, is fully sovereign. Every component is designed, built, and maintained in France under French control. It's proof that autonomy is possible, that a European nation can secure itself without relying on American warheads. Compared with Britain's deterrent, which depends partly on US technology and support, France's model looks increasingly like the way forward. And let's not forget that several other nations once upon a time had secret nuclear programs that could once again be rebooted. In example, Sweden, West Germany, Italy, Switzerland, and Spain, and that it only took France a few years to develop theirs. With cooperation, that could be a lot quicker. When it comes to scale, the comparison between Europe and the US is revealing. The US defense budget sat at around $850 billion in 2024. European NATO members together spend around $450 billion, about half. As we discussed in our detailed video, where we discussed the US versus European defense budget in depth, that still makes Europe, collectively, the second largest military spender on Earth before the new massive spending spree of at least €1 trillion gets signed off in Brussels. But money isn't everything. While the US has its hiccups in procurement, where weapons programs get scrapped after wasting billions in research and development, like the F-22 or Freedom-class littoral combat ship, the US spends efficiently through unified procurement of the basic things their military needs, while Europe spreads its investment across dozens of national industries. There are at the top of my head at least 7 different main battle tank models, 29 different frigate designs, and dozens of separate missile programs in Europe. The result is duplication, not lack of skill, but lack of scale. If Europe consolidated even a portion of that effort, like the Joint Future Combat Air System or the European Sky Shield Initiative, it could field a force far more efficient and independent, likely without some of the horrible wastage seen in the US system. And again, France's example stands out. When it left NATO's Integrated Command in 1966, it built a defense ecosystem around national control, creating Dassault, Thales, MBDA, and Naval Group as world-class players. That same model could be replicated at the European level today. As we discussed in our video on this topic, France showed that sovereignty in defense can sustain a competitive, export-driven industry that also strengthens alliances with jobs right across the continent. The analysts at the International Institute for Strategic Studies estimate that replacing US military capability in Europe would cost roughly 250 to 300 billion euro over the next decade. That's not cheap, but it's within reach. Germany alone has set aside 100 billion euros in its Zeitenwende fund, while Poland, the Baltics, and the Nordics are all boosting defense budgets dramatically. But a full American withdrawal wouldn't just hurt Europe, it would hurt the US too. American bases in Germany, Italy, and the UK are the launch pads for operations across the Middle East and Africa. Lose them, and the US loses global reach. Most aid to Israel, most air bridges into the Middle East, and most logistics into Africa flow through Europe. Rerouting all of that back through the continental US would slow operations and cost billions annually. There's also a side of this equation that rarely gets mentioned, just how good a deal Europe's bases are for the United States. Take Ramstein Air Base in Germany, the linchpin of US operations across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. It's effectively American sovereign territory maintained on German soil, with Berlin covering a large share of the costs through subsidies, tax breaks, and infrastructure support. The same goes for Spangdahlem, Aviano in Italy, RAF Lakenheath in the UK, and Rota naval base in Spain, all host nation funded to varying degrees. Across NATO, European governments pay billions every year to host US facilities, easing Washington's budget while giving it forward-deployed reach at minimal expense. In total, European allies cover between 25 and 35% of the real cost of US troop presence, from housing to utilities and base construction. It's hard to imagine a more convenient arrangement for the US, projection power paid for in part by others. Walking away from that wouldn't just weaken America's reach, it would mean abandoning some of the most cost-effective assets in its entire global posture. Then, as we've discussed in our very popular series on the staggering cost of losing Europe's arms market, there's the economic loss. Europe is the largest buyer of American arms, from F-35s and Patriots to Apaches and HIMARS. Those contracts sustain hundreds of thousands of jobs across the US. Pull the troops and the contracts eventually follow, a hit to America's defense industry and its influence alike. Why would Europe need American gear that would work well with US troops if the US won't come to Europe's aid? If Washington steps back, Europe has two choices: retreat into fragmented national armies, the wet dream of Viktor Orban, the MAGA movement and Vladimir Putin, or become a cohesive defense community. The tools are already there: shared air defense under the Sky Shield Initiative, joint drones and aircraft under FCAS and GCAP, integrated command centers through NATO, the Joint Expeditionary Force, NORDEFCO, and the EU. The next step isn't to match America's global footprint, it's to secure Europe's own theater. The threats Europe faces are regional: Russian expansionism, instability in North Africa, cyber attacks, disinformation, migration from Middle Eastern wars, sabotage, and hybrid warfare. They don't require 20 aircraft carriers. They require coordination, mobility, decency, and resilience. If the US leaves, Europe can and must build that capability, not by copying American gung-ho power projection, but by perfecting its own localized variant, and by utilizing some of the best bases which would be left vacant by a US withdrawal. A US withdrawal would be a shock, but not the end of Europe's security. France, Sweden, and my own Finland have already walked this road. When Charles de Gaulle pulled France out of NATO's integrated command, he wasn't rejecting the alliance, he was reclaiming sovereignty. France built its own nuclear deterrent, its own command structure, its own industry. Today, it is the only European nation with a fully sovereign, soon-to-be nuclear triad. That independence became the foundation for a thriving, world-class defense sector, enough ambiguity in its nuclear program to scare even Vladimir Putin, and an army that can beat back military opposition beyond France's borders. Europe doesn't need America's global expeditionary machine. It doesn't need to fight wars in the Pacific, Middle East, or the Persian Gulf on behest of unreliable US presidents. But it does need control over its own defense, from the Arctic to the Mediterranean, from the Baltics to the Black Sea. Its challenges are regional, but its solutions must be collective. A full American exit would force that transition. It would likely push Europe to pool resources, share intelligence, standardize systems, and build true strategic autonomy, not out of pride, but necessity. We're already seeing the embers of this as Europe steps up to arm Ukraine, build its factories, and help it co-develop state-of-the-art weaponry. Real sovereignty isn't about matching the United States. It's about not needing it. France, Sweden, and Finland proved that autonomy can work. If Europe follows, it won't simply defend its borders. It will defend the idea that Western security shouldn't hinge on the outcome of a single US election and having to live through chaos every 4 years. This is Europe's moment, not to imitate the US, but to stand as its equal without having to grovel for leaders of a country which is quickly spiraling into a situation Europe had its fair share of in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. To end on some good news, NATO, even without the US, still holds its own against most world actors. On manpower, European NATO and Canada field about 1.5 million active troops, more than Russia's pre-war total of about 1.3 million, though slightly below China's roughly 2 million. In the air, they operate about 1,700 combat aircraft, with 4th and 5th generation fleets growing fast, compared with Russia's claimed but unlikely about 900 and China's claimed about 2,300. On armor, European NATO and Canada have about 6,500 main battle tanks on paper, roughly half truly modern and ready, while Russia sustains numbers likely at historical lows after heavy losses, and China fields a claimed 3,000 to 4,000 main battle tanks. In infantry fighting vehicles and armored personnel carriers, Europe and Canada, as well as China, retains many tens of thousands, while Russia again likely sits at the few models their industry can make and refurbish, nowhere near their pre-war totals well over 10,000 pieces. At sea, European and Canadian fleets together displace about 2.8 to 3 million tons, topping Russia's pre-war figure of 1.3 million and sitting in the same range as China's 2.8 million. The gaps that remain are less about raw combat power and more about strategic lift, tankers, munition stockpiles, and sustainment. But stack for stack, NATO without the US is still a heavyweight, and that is before Europe and Canada's rearmament gets properly underway. Before you go, because this was September's voted topic, I've put a new post in the community tab so you can suggest and vote on October's. Get your ideas in and have a lovely weekend, everyone.